Welcome to our study of the book of Esther. Today we come to chapter 4. And before we do that, before we get into that, I'd like to call your attention once again to the series of commentaries, Bible commentaries, written by our brethren, members of the Churches of Christ. It's the Truth for Today commentary. And the one that we're working through now, I'm working from, is Dr. Coy Roper's work. And I would recommend any of these commentaries to you. I have no financial relationship to these brethren at all, but it's just good material. And sometimes people will say things to me like, well, I don't need anything like that. I've got the Bible. And certainly the Bible is the beginning and the end. It is the authority in matters spiritual. But when you have a work like Dr. Roper's, he will fill in historical information about the context that will deepen one's understanding, and you'll enjoy it very much. It will enrich your study. You'll do word studies on the various terms that are key, significant religious terms within the text, and give you some insight into the original language, and that too is very useful information. We'll begin this morning with chapter 4, and it's going to give us Mordecai's request to Queen Esther. Following the publication of the king's decree that all of the Jews are to be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month, the future for Israel looked very bleak indeed. And however, in this we're going to see that God has provided a way out in which the nation could be rescued. Chapter 4 begins with the story of how the Jews discovered and utilized a way of escape from destruction. I want us to begin together reading the first 3 verses. And this Mordecai goes into mourning. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. When Mordecai learns that the Jews are to be annihilated, of course he, along with all the Jews in the empire, mourn over this. Verse 1, how did Mordecai learn all that had been done? For instance, the fact that the king was to receive 10,000 talents of silver when the Jews were killed. How did Mordecai know that? That's certainly not made known in the published decree. Possibly, in fact, obviously, really, he had sources within the palace who gave information that was not public knowledge, not common knowledge. Perhaps some of the Jews who served at the king's pleasure in his palace informed Mordecai, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish community, it seems apparent, and they tell him what's taken place. Another idea is that he overheard this information as he is sitting in the city gate where royal business is conducted sometimes. In response to the king's decree, Mordecai tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and wails loudly and bitterly. All of these things are evidence of profound grief and mourning. The tearing of one's clothes conveys, of course, deep emotion, often associated with personal loss, with tragedy, with death. To put on sackcloth and ashes is a sign of repentance in view of anticipated and imminent destruction, or when one is mourning a death. It's also customary for the Persians to tear their garments and to wail bitterly as signs of grief. Herodotus, the historian, reported that the people of Susa did this after hearing that the Persians had been defeated in the Battle of Salamis. And so this behavior on the part of Mordecai is consistent with what was culturally practiced in the city of Susa. We understand that. Verse 2, Mordecai didn't restrict his expression of his deep, deep distress and sorrow to the privacy of his own home. Quite to the contrary. Instead, he went out into the city square, out into the city proper, just outside the king's gate. And by this public display, he apparently has every intention of drawing attention, perhaps even the attention of Queen Esther. However, Mordecai refrained from going in because no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. A writer, a scholar by the name of Anthony Tomasino, thought that given the self-indulgence of the Persian monarchs, it seems in character that they would prohibit any of the subjects of the king to come into his presence and impose their distress on the monarch. That interpretation is supported by another instance in the Bible when Nehemiah was fearful of having shown signs of sadness in the presence of King Artaxerxes in Nehemiah 2, verses 1 and 2. We come to verse 3 of the book of Esther, and Mordecai didn't mourn alone, far from it. By his association and his prominence in the community and in getting the word out, his mourning was replicated by thousands of other Jews who were fasting and weeping and wailing and lying on sackcloth and ashes. And by this time, the decree that is described in the previous chapter had been proclaimed throughout the city of Susa. And the writer states in chapter 3 and verse 15 that the city was in an uproar about it. And so the news is spreading to distant cities. All the people of God in every province of the empire shared the sorrow that Mordecai was feeling. In verses 4 through 8, Esther's concern for Mordecai is made evident in the reply, the exchange between the two. Then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he didn't accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and to learn what this was and why it was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her and to order her to go into the king and implore his favor, and to plead with him for her people. When Mordecai's mourning comes to Esther's attention, she tries to do something for him. He then sends word informing her that Haman's plot is afoot, and he begs her to intercede with the king in behalf of the Jews. That's what's going to take place, what we've just read. Verse 4, those who tended to Esther's needs told her about Mordecai's public display of grief. Obviously, they knew something about the relationship between the queen and this man. Perhaps they had, during the approximately 5 years of her reign that has now transpired, perhaps they've carried numerous messages back and forth between the two. Mordecai had constantly tried to stay close and in contact with his foster daughter, and upon learning of his condition, Esther was so upset that the text tells us she writhed in great anguish. Other versions say that she was deeply distressed. The New Revised Standard has it. Some say she was greatly distraught. The REB has it. Well, the form of the Hebrew word here means to writhe in fear. What caused Esther to be so emotionally distressed? Mordecai's public display, coupled with the fact of her association with him, means that it's likely to become known that she's Jewish. And she may have been attempting to keep that a secret. However, it seems more likely that she was upset because her foster father was so upset. And his awful grieving was more than she could bear. It was distressing to her. There's a love relationship, obviously, between these two. Esther sent new garments to Mordecai as if to say, take off the sackcloth, don't mourn anymore. Put on your new clothes and try to be happy. It's possible that Esther sent Mordecai clothes so he could put on different attire and then be allowed to enter into the palace gates. And in that setting, she might be able to offer comfort and perhaps even talking face to face with him about what his concerns are. Obviously, Esther did not understand why Mordecai was mourning. He refused her gift as if to say, I will not quit mourning, I can't. Something's terribly wrong and I've got to express my grief. Apparently, Mordecai's intention was to make Esther aware that the Jews were in imminent danger of annihilation and that her help was required to save them. In verse 5, Esther got the message. Something's seriously wrong, and it would be solved, not with new clothes. Therefore, she sent an attendant. His name was Hathach, who was one of the king's eunuchs, and he was to find out what was causing Mordecai such profound distress and grief. And one translation says Esther sent him to Mordecai to learn why and wherefore of it all. Clearly, though, all of the city of Susa was in disarray. It was upset and distressed about this decree. Esther is unaware of that. And we think today, well, how in the world could that be? She's the queen. Well, it appears that the king's harem, including the queen, were kept in isolation from the world outside the palace gates, and even perhaps outside the king's harem. Verses 6 and 7, the eunuch Hathach, whose name means good one, carried out Esther's instructions. He went to the city square and he found Mordecai. And he told him to inform the queen about all that had happened to him. And the phrase, all that had happened to him, is interpreted by some to be a self-centered way of speaking about the Jews' problem. But that doesn't appear to be the case. In fact, that just doesn't hold water. The expression is simply a way to introduce the whole story of the threat to the Jews as it began with Mordecai. And so it's related here as to what precipitated all of these events. Carol M. Bechtel thought that the curious phrase suggests that Mordecai is telling the story from the very beginning, namely with his refusal to bow before Haman. Apparently, Mordecai not only knew about the king's decree, but he was also aware of the role that he himself had played in having that decree come as a result of the influence of Haman, who is the villain in this story. He was well informed on the details, even though much of what had happened had occurred in private. Clearly, he's got sources on the inside. He even told Hathach the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to Xerxes. Verse 8. To confirm what he was saying, Mordecai gave Esther's messenger a written copy of the king's edict that he might show it to her. Probably the decree had been posted in prominent places around the city of Susa for all to see and for anyone to copy. Even if it had not been publicly displayed, Mordecai's sources would have no trouble providing him with a copy. Mordecai sends word to Esther to go in to the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. Mordecai raised Esther. She was his adopted daughter. So it seems perfectly reasonable for him to order her to do what he said, even though she's the queen. In answer to his instructions, in answer to her inquiry, Mordecai is making it clear that he's got every reason to mourn. Anybody in that circumstance should mourn. The crucial part of his message was that the Jews, Esther's people, are in trouble, real trouble, and he believes that she could and should intervene to save her people. We come to verses 9 through 14, and there we find a powerful appeal delivered by Mordecai. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." So while Esther is hesitant to plead with the king for her people, in verse 8, Mordecai uses powerful and persuasive arguments to convince her, to change her mind. In verses 9 through 11, Hathach faithfully delivered Mordecai's message to the queen in verse 9, and she ordered him to make a reply in verse 10. Esther at first resisted the instruction from her adoptive father. Her initial reluctance, however, should not be branded as selfishness or cowardice, but she's simply voicing an understandable concern about both her life and the probable failure that the proposed mission would bring. After all, everyone in the empire knows that to approach the king in the inner court without being summoned would likely result in death. Herodotus describes such a custom, attributing it to the need for the king to be protected from would-be assassins and from others who might divert his attention from kingly concerns. The only thing that could save a person's life if they came into the king's presence uninvited was for the king to extend his golden scepter to that individual. Chapter 4, verse 11. Now, the danger, as Esther saw it, was that the king might not be glad to see her, and he might not hold the scepter to her. After all, he's not summoned her, invited her to share his company for a month. Esther seemed to be concerned that the king's affection for her might have waned, so she might not have much influence with him at this time. Trying to help the Jews by appealing to the king might only get her killed. In verse 12, they related Esther's words to Mordecai. And apparently, Hathach was no longer by himself, but one or more of Esther's servants must have accompanied him to deliver the queen's message to her adoptive father, who was also her familial cousin. Verses 13 and 14. Mordecai responds with another message. He finally persuades Esther by pointing to several truths. First of all, she was in as much danger as the rest of the Jews. She would not escape just because she lived in the palace. Verse 13. He must have thought that Esther's Jewishness had become known or was going to become known before the date of destruction arrived. Secondly, if Esther did not seek to help the Jews, deliverance would arrive from some other source, some other place. First part of verse 14. How he thought such a deliverance might arrive is not specified. Ancient Jewish sources understood the language as a veiled reference to God. In other words, if Esther didn't do her part, deliverance would still arise from the Lord. Most likely, Mordecai was expressing his faith that God would take care of his people and would not allow the nation to be destroyed. And this belief, of course, is based on the Lord's promises to Abraham, and it has been confirmed and reconfirmed many times since the days of the patriarchs. Nevertheless, if deliverance came to the Jewish people in some other way, Esther and her family might not survive. What did Mordecai mean when he said that Esther and her family would perish if the Jews were saved without Esther's help? There is no certain answer to that question. Possibly Mordecai is implying that God might punish Esther and her family if she remained silent. Brother Clayton Winters believed that Mordecai was saying deliverance would certainly come for God's holy people from another source, but they themselves would lose their lives and their inheritance among the people of the covenant. Mordecai would have been personally concerned about such a threatening statement, since the destruction of her father's house includes him and his family. It is possible that Esther had attained royalty, he points out, attained to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai was saying that Esther should see this challenge as an opportunity to fulfill God's purpose for her. Implied in this is the belief that it was God, not fortune, not circumstances, not mere chance, that had made Esther the queen of Persia and caused to be that she could intercede with the king, that God had done that on behalf of his people in this time of crisis. Mordecai was telling her that this was her moment. This is her time. Time for her to stand up for God and make a difference. Would to God that his people would see the circumstances that we now face as their moment and their time to make a stand for what is right. Esther makes her decision in verses 15 through 17. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go in to the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did as Esther commanded him. Esther, convinced by Mordecai's persuasive arguments, agrees here to approach the king on behalf of her people. Verses 15 and 16, we see Esther fully realizes that she's risking her life. So she wants to make preparation for that. She sought help from her Jewish community and by implication is seeking God's help. She sent another reply to Mordecai instructing him to have all the Jews to fast for 3 days and nights. And she said that she and her maidens would do the very same thing before she approached the king. Fasting was used to express sorrow, to indicate repentance, and is typically accompanied by a season of prayer. Both Mordecai's words about Esther's providential appointment as queen and Esther's request for fasting to take place indicate that though God is not named in the book, he himself is present in all of these events. The Jews, including Mordecai and Esther, believed in the Lord, and they saw him as being in control over the affairs of men. You know, he's never relinquished that position from that day to this. Otherwise, Esther would not have required her fellow Jews to fast on her behalf. If she hadn't believed that God was in charge of this world, she wouldn't have done that. Do you believe? I don't think you would be considering these lessons if you weren't a believer. We need to act like we believe. Esther said that after this period of fasting, she's going to go into the king. She's going to approach Xerxes regardless of what the consequences may be. And when she said, if I perish, I perish, she is undoubtedly expressing what she sees as a very real possibility. In spite of the danger involved, she resolves to do what she can do to save her people. Verse 17, Mordecai then did what Esther said. These verses mark a new development in Esther's character. Before this paragraph, she's been passive, just been passive. She became active right here in verse 17. Whereas she had previously been subjected to others' actions and others' decisions, she now takes charge of her own mind and her own decisions. And she remains that way. She obeyed the commands of Mordecai in chapter 2 in verses 10 and 20, but now she commands him. And he obeys. Chapter 4, verse 17. She remains a dominant figure throughout the rest of this story, all the way through the rest of the book. It's interesting that in verse 8, Mordecai sends a message to order Queen Esther to take action, but in verse 17, Mordecai did just as the queen commanded him. Joyce G. Baldwin saw this moment as a turning point for Esther, and it quite clearly is. She wrote, from this point on, Esther, who had up till now done as Mordecai told her, herself takes the lead and assumes responsibility in her own right. In this way, the chapter ends on a suspenseful note. Esther would approach the king. Would she survive or not? Could the Jews be saved, or was it hopeless? Later chapters will answer that question. In this chapter, we see the character of this woman come forth. And we see in her sheer courage of her convictions, courage of her faith. We see faithful acceptance of an assignment that is fraught with mortal danger. We see family obedience to her beloved adoptive father, Mordecai. And we see patriotic zeal that one is compelled to admire. And we see determination to rescue her people from massacre at whatever cost. And we see her evident trust in God and ultimate confidence in His blessings. These aspects of this lady are worthy of notice and worthy of imitation. She is courageous when taken to the palace. She's courageous when she follows the instructions of Mordecai not to reveal that she's Jewish. But when she learns that God's people are targeted for extermination, and Mordecai calls upon her to reveal her background and help her people, that's Esther's defining moment. All of us ought to think about in the day and the time in which we live, what shall be our defining moment. I hope to see you next time as we consider chapter 5. God bless you.